PC gamers have been suffering for about a year and a half now with a shortage situation. You can't buy a graphics card, they're very overpriced, and people don't want to pay double or more what MSRP is supposed to be. There have been various solutions offered to us in that time frame. Nvidia had their light hash rate cards, and now AMD is telling us that the 6500 XT that is launching today for $200 MSRP should maybe also be more widely available to people, not because of any special steps they've taken to prevent the card from mining cryptocurrency, but simply because the card is fairly cut down. It's only a 4 gig VRAM buffer with a 64-bit interface and just a PCI Express 4.0 by 4 connection to your CPU. But will all of these things hurt gaming just as much as it hurts the card's mining performance? Today we're going to check that out.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by Corsair's new Xeneon monitor, the 32QHD165, featuring an ultra-slim 32-inch 2560 by 1440 QHD screen with 1 millisecond moving picture response time, a 165 Hz refresh rate fast IPS panel, quantum dot technology, and 100% sRGB, 100% Adobe RGB, and 98% DCI-P3 color gamut coverage for more vivid natural colors, HDR400 support, and convenient features like the integrated multi-mount point for cameras, mics, or lighting built into the stand to round out the package. So for more on Corsair's Xeneon monitor, click the sponsor link in the video description. So you may have noticed a bunch of videos going up on this card early this morning, and I decided not to post my video right when the embargo lifts because I am also going to be checking actual retail prices. We're supposed to be able to buy this card for $200, and AMD says that because of the various ways that they've cut it down, they think it will be so unappealing to miners that you might actually still be able to buy it for that $200 MSRP, or typically cards like the XFX Quick 210 version that I'm looking at here might sell for $10, $15, maybe $40 or $50 more than that suggested MSRP. However, again, with the past year and a half of grossly overpriced graphics cards situation that we've been dealing with, a lot of cards are selling for double MSRP or more. So there is one question, is this card even worth $200? And then the follow-up question, is this card going to be worth whatever it's selling for live today? And towards the end of the video, we'll take a look at actual retail prices, at least in the first few hours after launch. Today I'd like to focus on how this card might fall short, specifically for people who might be looking at a potential upgrade from a slightly older system that does not have PCI Express 4.0 support. In order to have PCI Express 4.0 support, you need either an AMD Ryzen 3000 series or 5000 series processor that's paired with a 500 series motherboard. 400 series and before only have PCI Express 3.0 support. Or on the Intel side, you need an 11th gen or 12th gen processor, and the 11th gen processors pair with 500 series chipset motherboards and the LGA 1200 socket, and the newer 12th gen processors pair with 600 series motherboards with the LGA 1700 socket. Now, it is my opinion that anyone who does have a system with PCIe 4.0 support likely built it within the past year or two, and likely also has at least a reasonably good gaming graphics card to go along with that. So the prospect for a $200 6500 XT to be an upgrade might be aimed at people with older systems and only PCIe 3.0. But here's where we can take a look at the specs for this graphics card, the 6500 XT, at least the baseline specs from AMD. This is based on the new RDNA 2 architecture, and it is pretty much the first card available at retail that is manufactured on TSMC's N6 or 6 nanometer node. It is a very small die size, only 107 square millimeters as compared to, say, a last gen RX 570, which is 232. It has 16 compute units, and it does have hardware ray tracing acceleration, although it's not going to blow anyone out of the water, but it is at least there. Looking at the rest of the specs, you'll see some trade-offs compared to an RX 570 that launched all the way back in 2017. Now, it is of course a new GPU architecture, so there are going to be some benefits there. However, we're looking at 1024 stream processors compared to the RX 570's 2048. We are looking at much higher clock speeds, and that is one of the benefits of the RDNA 2 architecture. It can hit much higher frequencies, and at least in terms of raw compute performance, we are looking at least a slight upgrade compared to the RX 570, although again, that card launched in 2017 for about the same price. Down here at the bottom though, I think are the biggest points of contentions and the things that I think are going to hold this card back the most, although we'll see in just a moment. A 64-bit memory interface for its 4 gigs of VRAM compared to a 256-bit interface for the 570, and a PCI Express interface of PCIe 4.0 by 4. Realistically, what this means, and we're looking at a chart of PCI Express versions here from 1.0 all the way up to 6.0, which was just recently announced. With every version, the bandwidth doubles, your gigatransfers per second, and then your actual bandwidth over here. So from 3.0 to 4.0 with a by 1 connection, you go from 1 gigabyte per second to 2 gigabytes per second. And if you have a full by 16 connection with PCIe 4.0, you get 32 gigabytes per second, and a by 4 connection there would be 8 gigabytes per second. Incidentally, that would be the same available bandwidth as PCIe 3.0 by 8 or PCIe 2.0 by 16. So that brings up two questions in terms of AMD's decision to make this the connection that this card uses. Is 8 gigabytes per second enough bandwidth for this card to get the most performance out of it possible? And what happens when you plug a PCI Express 4.0 by 4 device into a PCI Express 3.0 slot? This is an Elgato 4K 60 Pro capture card, and it has a by 4 connection. The top part right here is the power, and then the lower part is the actual data connection. If you're looking at this card, you might think like, oh, that looks like a full by 16 slot card. And in fact, if you run GPU-Z, the very popular GPU statistics and monitoring tool from TechPowerUp, and run it with this card, it will tell you it has a by 16 connection. And that's because there's a PCI Express controller chip that this connects to, and that is what is limited to by 4. What that effectively means for people with older systems, though, that only have PCI Express 3.0, is that you can't downgrade this to PCI Express 3.0 by 8 and still get the full 8 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. You have to go to PCI Express 3.0 by 4, which cuts the bandwidth in half to 4 gigabytes per second. And that is what we're going to test right now with my test bed right here, which is an AMD Ryzen 5600X CPU installed and a X570 motherboard, where we can easily go and toggle between PCI Express 3.0 and PCI Express 4.0 mode. Alright, so we've now completed our benchmark runs with 4 different games: Doom Eternal, Resident Evil Village, Far Cry 6, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And it's important to keep in mind that depending on the game that you're playing, the resolution that you're playing at, and the actual graphics settings that the game is running at, it might need more or less video memory from your graphics card. Higher resolutions are going to eat up more VRAM, which is why this 4 gig card is advertised by AMD as being a 1080 class card. They don't even want you to try 1440 or 4K with it. And then even higher graphics settings, like going from medium to high to ultra, the textures there use up more data and need to be loaded up into your system RAM. If the game requires more memory than what the graphics card has, then it's going to be dipping into your system memory, and for that, the connection, the PCI Express connection between the graphics card and the CPU, is what may or may not be causing a bottleneck. I ran these games at medium or high settings. You can see the results right here. And let's go down these really quick, because some games, like Doom Eternal, for example, won't even let you run the game at a higher resolution or a higher graphics setting that will use more VRAM than what your graphics card can provide. So I found that 1080p high setting used exactly 4 gigs of VRAM, and so that's what we're using there. For Resident Evil Village at 1080 with the balanced setting, we're using about 4.65 gigabytes of VRAM. For Far Cry 6, we're using 4.87 gigabytes of VRAM, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider will typically consume between 6 and 7.5 gigabytes of VRAM at 1080, depending on whether you're using the high or the medium preset, and we were running at the medium preset, so it was closer to 6 gigs. The first set of results here is at PCI Express 4.0 by 4, and the second set of results is PCI Express 3.0 by 4, and you can see we're getting good playable frame rates: 77.3 for Doom Eternal, 107 for Resident Evil Village, 82 for Far Cry 6, and 95.9 for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. But those numbers certainly drop by varying amounts if you switch over to PCIe 3.0. And bear in mind, not only is this PCIe 3.0, but it's also PCI Express 3.0 with an AMD Ryzen 5600X CPU, which is also a good CPU, which is going to have better IPC performance than some of these CPUs that are 2, 3, or 4 years old. So this is allowing us to isolate PCIe 3.0 results versus 4.0 results without throwing anything else into the mix. But it is important to note that if you are using an older system like an Intel 9th gen processor or a 1st gen Ryzen chip, you're probably not going to achieve these same numbers even with 3.0. That said, we got anywhere from 2.2 to 12.6% better performance running with PCIe 4.0 by 4. The number increases a little bit more even if you're looking at 1% low results, as much as 15.9% faster with Far Cry 6 here, for example. The thing that somewhat concerns me about these results is that not everyone is going to be able to do an A/B comparison between PCIe 3.0 and PCIe 4.0, especially if you're using an older system that doesn't support it. So you might be getting anywhere from 2% to 15% or more less performance out of a 6500 XT if you're using an older system, and that performance hit might increase even more if you're trying to use higher settings that requires more VRAM allocation, and you might be none the wiser because you have no idea what kind of performance you're supposed to be getting. So while the PCI Express situation is something that I think you should really be keeping in mind if you're considering the 6500 XT, especially if you're on an older platform, it's not the end of the world, and so I wanted to also try out just some real-world world gaming, so we're going to test some Apex Legends as well as some Overwatch. Maybe allow me and Joe to have a little bit of fun today and actually play some games. And for that, we'll also take a look at the cooling performance of this graphics card. All right, we're doing some live gameplay now. Joe is in the driver's seat and we're going to play some Apex Legends. Starting off with a look at the settings we're running at 1080, of course. We have VSync disabled. And here's a quick look at the settings. We're in the high preset, which is what Apex recommends if you have a 4 gig VRAM graphics card. And you can quickly take a look at the rest of the settings right here. We're also using the AMD software overlay on screen right here, so that's available in the top right, and we can see the frame rate there as well as the GPU clock and the GPU current temperature and the GPU fan. So that will let us keep an eye on the performance of the graphics card as Joe plays through a game here. And I have to quickly apologize to Joe because I'm forcing him to play like with none of his usual equipment that he plays with, or like the amount of space he usually has for his mouse hand. But I'm sure he's still going to do really well. I'm sure he's still going to...
I'll laugh if I actually win a game. I'm like, okay, that's a total accident.
Joe is also out of practice, we are told.
I've been playing guitar like non-stop lately.
Just to rattle off some statistics, though, that we have been seeing in performance. The drop-in is usually a little bit lower in frame rate, around 70 to 80 frames per second is what we're seeing. Although when Joe is actually playing the game here, we're seeing frame rates in the 90 to 120 FPS range, which is good. Good, playable. The game looks quite nice using these settings. We can also see the GPU clock is running at about 2846 megahertz, which is a nice high frequency. GPU fan is only hitting about 800 to 850 RPMs, and the power is only getting up to 80 to 90 watts. So this GPU could very clearly just barely almost not need supplemental PCI Express power, but it is running a little bit higher than that. And the actual board power for this card is 107 watts. So we're still within that range. Temperature for the GPU is also staying pretty cool, only hitting about 58, 59 degrees Celsius. So the card is working just fine in terms of what Joe is doing here. But again, we can see the VRAM utilization is only hitting about 3.7 gigabytes, 3,775 megabytes, and that is part of the reason why things are smooth sailing for now. That's because we're not playing a game that is taxing this graphics card and using more VRAM than is available. Get him, Joe, get him.
Oh my god, I'm getting my ass kicked. Ah, goddammit, I suck. Alright, got one at least.
Hey, that's a kill. A kill's a kill.
Alright.
Hey, you got a kill? That's what matters.
No, it's not a kill, knocked him, but I mean,
knockdown.
Still.
Good job, Joe.
Yeah, it's been a while since I played the game.
Thank you for your time. Now we're going to move on to some Overwatch. All right, same deal for me. I'm just going to jump into a game real quick and see how the performance is. Here's a quick look at the settings. The overlay is kind of blocking a little bit, so bear that in mind. But VSync is off, and we are currently running. Well, I should switch this to not being blocked. We're using the Ultra preset to start out here, so we'll see how this goes. All right, so frame rate, like clock speed and temperature seem about the same, maybe even a little bit cooler. Yes, frame rates are pretty decent, in the mid 90s and low hundreds for the most part. GPU temperature and clock speed and everything are holding about the same, and my team is getting absolutely destroyed. All right, I should have realized this before, but we're actually render scaling right now. This is a automatic thing that Overwatch does in order to adjust the game's performance to match the output of your system. All right, so I'm going to switch that back to 100% to give us basically the native resolution, and we'll see if that changes anything. Actually, that appears to have boosted our frame rate by quite a lot. We're now hitting in the 170 to 190 frame rate FPS range. So turning that render scale off does appear to have given us more frames. We're hitting anywhere from 150 to even 180 to 190 now. So we'll see if maybe we can win this game instead of losing. Who knows? Who knows? Oh, I think we might have it. We might have it. Victory! So the main point here is that I wanted to play a video game. Overwatch is not necessarily the most difficult game to run, especially at 1080, so this was a little bit more of a proof of concept and to show you guys what kind of Overwatch-ish performance you could get out of this card. And the answer is up in the high hundreds to even the low 200s range if you're using the settings that I was using right now, which is great if you're gonna connect this to a high refresh rate monitor, for example. So what have we learned today about the 6500 XT? I think the main key point that you guys should take away from this is that this is a graphics card. capable of running 3D games, and we've shown a few of them today. Of course, that's kind of to be expected, but if I want to talk about, I guess, the positive elements of this, this cooler and the card that XFX has put together seems to perform quite well. Doesn't get too hot, runs nice and quiet in terms of the fan speed, and honestly that's in part due to the fact that we're using the newer RDNA2 architecture, 6nm manufacturing process, a card that has a very low board power, in fact such that it's kind of surprising that they weren't able to make a 75 watt version of this card that doesn't require a 6-pin supplemental power connector, but it seems like all of them do. But of course those positive aspects of this graphics card are a pretty short list, and it's something that is only a strong selling point because of the market situation that we're in. But of course those positive aspects of the card are somewhat limited, and giving AMD too much credit for simply creating a functional graphics card, or a graphics card that stays relatively cool and quiet, or a graphics card that can play a reasonable amount of games at 1080p at reasonable frame rates is not exactly a huge accomplishment right now. What would be an accomplishment is if they could keep it in stock for more than an hour or two, and for that let's check in on launch day inventory availability. So here I am reporting from launch day, and I'm gonna get to pricing and availability, but first there's a lot of reviews that went up, so let's quickly take a look at a handful of those from some of my colleagues in the tech review industry. TechPowerUp apparently did not get sampled directly from AMD for something like the first time in 15 years from what I've read, but they did get an Asus 6500 XT Tough Edition that they put through the paces. They were fair enough in the summary, listing quite a few of the positives that this card does have. It is the first 6nm GPU. It was very quiet. It might be unattractive for miners, but we'll see if that plays out in availability. Very low overall performance though, serious performance loss on PCIe 3.0, terrible ray tracing, no support for AV1 video hardware decode, and also this means it won't work with AMD's Relive technology that allows you to capture and stream your gameplay, which is a big miss, I think, as well. Lower efficiency and overclocking is also hampered, apparently, but they also did a PCI Express scaling article, and here we can sort of take a look at a summary of performance at 1080 versus other cards in the same range on the market, and this article is linked in the video description down below if you want to read the whole thing. But using PCI Express 4.0 in the best case scenario, it is barely outpacing the 1650 Super 4 gig. It cannot beat the last gen 5500 XT 4GB, which slightly outpaces it here as well. And if you're unfortunate enough to be running this in PCI Express 3.0 mode, it can't even beat a 1066GB, although I guess it does barely outpace the RX 570, although it's gonna get beaten by the RX 580. And a lot of these cards launched 4 or 5 years ago, so there's really not much excuse for AMD to be putting this card out right now, except for the fact that, you know, they're gonna sell out anyway. GamersNexus titled their review video, AMD RX 6500 XT is worse than 2016's GPUs. Steve and team did a great job as always, but again, just looking at a sample of some of their tests, the 6500 XT is down here, not even beating a GTX 970 or the 1066 gig for that matter. So obviously GamersNexus didn't think much of that. Over at Techspot, there's a written article by our friend Steve from Hardware Unboxed where he describes it as the worst GPU release since I can remember in over 2 decades of doing the job. Steve's video on Hardware Unboxed is just titled Worst GPU, Corner Cutting. And here again we have confirmation and validation that the last gen 5500 XT 4GB model is outpacing the 6500 XT even with PCIe 4.0 mode, to say nothing of the performance loss in PCIe 3.0 mode. Honestly, the only charts where the 6500 XT looks good at all is if you're assuming that you can buy it for $200 new and run it in PCI Express 4.0 mode, then the cost per frame makes a little bit of sense, but that's comparing it to all these other GPUs at their street prices rather than their list prices. And it requires you to be able to buy one of these GPUs for $200. So let's take a look at Newegg's current availability, and they are all sold out. Out of stock, out of stock, out of stock. There were a couple models that were in stock even a couple hours after launch, but those also sold out quickly. And the ones that stayed in stock were versions like the Gigabyte Gaming OC. And this card lists for $300, just a 50% markup for a card that has been thoroughly lambasted by the entire tech review community. There are a handful of cards that are listing for $200, and that is to some degree showing you why it is important that AMD at least did come out with an MSRP for this card, as opposed to what Nvidia has done with like the RTX 3080 12GB, for example. Manufacturers do have base model cards that they're selling for that list price, but of course those are going to sell out immediately, and then the big jump up from there from $200 is $270, and honestly for a $200 card, a $70 markup for something that's just probably a slight overclock, and also for this card that we've already shown you some of the performance of, is not going to be worth it for anyone except somebody who's trying to resell it or someone who's trying to take advantage of the current shortage situation. And like, my God, Asus, really? You think you can sell your tough version for $360? Well, I guess you can. You're right, but it's out of stock. Meanwhile, over at Amazon, you can't even find any of these listed at all. And one last little random note to add, AMD had a 2020 blog post where they were sort of pointing out that their GPUs have more VRAM and that NVIDIA cards often have less. This article was available 24 to 48 hours ago. AMD went and removed it, apparently because they felt a little self-conscious about it given the launch of the 6500 XT with 4 gigs of VRAM. They were called out pretty quickly this morning by a bunch of publications, including Kit Guru, and apparently they've gone and re-enabled the post because it's just sort of a bad look. But just another example of the weirdness surrounding this launch and how AMD is trying to ride that fine line between launching a GPU that has some clear shortcomings and not really stating that publicly or making it widely known. And as expected, there are precisely 0 of these cards available even a few hours after launch on launch day. So what's the point of even making this video? The point is to warn you guys against a few other things you should be aware of. The card's limitations absolutely include that decision to go with PCI Express 4.0 by 4 as a connection standard, and anyone who is using an older platform that's limited to PCI Express Gen 3 should absolutely be keeping that in mind. You should also bear in mind some other limiting features about the card, like the video outs. At least on this unit, you get a single HDMI and a single display port, which obviously could be much better. It doesn't even support 3 displays out of the box. And for anyone who's interested in possibly streaming or doing a lot of video transcoding or editing, you should also bear in mind that there's no hardware H.264 or HEVC encoder in this, and no AV1 decoder.
Ew.
Yeah. And for anyone who's trying to talk themselves into a purchase by way of saying like, oh, well, I'm not just gonna game with it, I'm also gonna use it to start my new streaming business or something like that, that is a huge deterring factor for this card. I'd say the biggest disappointment for me for the 6500 XT though, is that if you look at AMD's decisions, even if you give them the benefit of the doubt that they did it in order to limit mining performance on this graphics card, what it really hurts is the people who might be in most need of an upgrade. And those are people who are currently running PCI Express 3.0 based systems, anything that wasn't built in the past year or two. I think that's a huge group of people who are likely on the lookout for a new graphics card, but they now have to decide whether or not it's worth the limiting performance that they might get with PCI Express 3.0, especially depending on the games they might play, the resolution they might be playing at, and whether or not they're in a situation where the game they're playing is going to call for more than 4 gigabytes of VRAM from the graphics card. Ultimately though, it is still a graphics card. It is still capable of running 3D games on some level. I didn't even try out AMD FSR, which can even boost frame rates a little bit further than this with games that support it and what you've seen today. And I have no doubt that AMD will be selling plenty of these cards, even if we're in a situation where a launch like this would never have flown if you went back a couple years and we weren't in a shortage situation like we are right now. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think about the 6500 XT, so leave me a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know if any of you have these in your sights and are planning on buying one. Let me know if the launch day reviews changed the minds of any of you guys out there who were thinking of buying this card but are now like, I'm not quite so sure. And of course, you can check the video description down below for links to some of the hardware that I've used today, as well as a link to my store at paulshardware.net, where you can buy shirts, mugs, pint glasses, and all manner of high quality merchandise to help get yourself something nice to wear, as well as support my channel. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button on the way out if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more videos like this one in the future, and we'll see you guys in the next one.